Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today we're continuing in part 2 of our series of risk screening, that is, determining whether or not a test for a risk is in fact effective and whether it should be used, or whether in fact screening for a specific form of risk is detrimental and not to be advised. Remember, in the last class we talked about a few key concepts that we need to keep in mind whenever we're screening for a particular risk. Two of those concepts are sensitivity and specificity. That is, we're testing to see whether false positives or false negatives will occur with a given test, and in all tests there's a false positive and false negative rate. This describes the accuracy of the test when we combine the two statistics, sensitivity and specificity. A third statistic that we need to keep in mind is the prevalence of the condition that we're screening for. What sort of rate of this particular condition, being a disease or a terrorist act or something of that nature, exists in the background population? Because as we'll see in today's lecture, the prevalence itself significantly affects the likelihood that we're going to be able to detect any sort of risk condition. And finally, the statistic that's most important to keep in mind is the PPV, or positive predictive value. What that asks is, given that a test result is either positive or negative, but in the most cases positive, what's the likelihood that the person who's been testing positive actually has the condition that we're looking for? And that ultimately is the statistical result that we're most interested in, because we don't actually know the condition ahead of time. That's why we're testing. And so what we're going to end up with in almost every circumstance is just a test result, a positive test or a negative test. Well, then we're going to have to decide, how valid is this test result for us? How much weight can we rely upon it? And is this something that is truly trustworthy as a result? Or should we have suspicions, even with a positive result, that our test was not accurate enough to do anything about? So that's ultimately what we're going to talk about a little today, is this PPV, or the positive predictive value, the most important statistic that you need to know whenever you're screening for risk. Let's look at an example of medical monitoring. Screening in advance for a latent medical condition, that is, a condition that's not currently manifesting itself, and trying to decide on the basis of a screening test whether or not further intervention is required. So here we have an individual, a patient, who has no current complaints or symptoms of an illness. But we decide, either because they were exposed to something or just as a matter of routine general medical practice, that we want to submit them to some sort of screening. Now, for a healthy individual, that is, a person who does not have the disease, and of course we wouldn't know this in advance, but if a person were healthy and did not have the disease, that's one possible outcome. And in the other circumstance, the person could be said to have the disease. That would be the opposite possibility. Of course, again, we don't know this in advance. That's why we're screening them. Now, we're going to perform a test on this person. And the test hopefully is going to tell us something about whether they are healthy or unhealthy. If the test comes out negative and the person were a healthy person, and again, we wouldn't know that in advance, but we're just saying we have an omniscient view right now, we're assuming that the person is healthy. If the test is negative, there's two interpretations or consequences that could come about from this. The first is that the person has no disease, and we would reassure them of such, that they have no disease. What's the possible outcome or benefit or harm of that? Well, this would actually be a benefit, because we would expect that if the person were truly healthy and the test came out negative, that would be a good thing, because then we could reassure the person correctly that they do not have disease, and they could go about their lives with psychological comfort and without further screening or without further intervention by doctors. And so that's, of course, a benefit if the test is truly negative and truly reflects a healthy person. That's a good thing. Conversely, if the person has the disease and tests positive, that too is a good thing, because there's a disease and we're allowed to early diagnose that disease in the person. And so in asking whether that's a harm or a benefit, of course that too is a benefit. If we can find out about the disease earlier, there's a greater chance that doctors can intervene to help the person alleviate the condition or even to cure it. The condition, however, can become problematic if the test is positive when the person is healthy. That is a false positive result. The person doesn't actually have the disease, but the test is inaccurate and comes up with a positive result. In this circumstance, we're going to create a cascade of problems because the person will be diagnosed as having the disease. This could lead to further unnecessary tests or even procedures, what's called iatrogenic disease or doctor-induced disease, where it's not the disease causing the person's symptoms, but the doctor's intervention itself leads to further complications. It can also lead to psychological harm from being labeled as having a disease when in fact the person is healthy. This, of course, is a series of harms. This is not good and not at all what we want. False positive results are problematic when we're testing someone. The converse of this is a false negative result. That is, the person has the disease, but the test comes up negative. We walk away telling the person falsely, reassuring them that in fact they don't have the disease when they really do. This too is a harm. We might not only give them false psychological comfort, but we might not even intervene after symptoms become manifest. Because we'll say, well, we tested them already and they came out negative. Surely these symptoms are the sign of something else. We don't need to screen again. So it might even lead us to delaying the person's treatment after the fact and cause even further harm than if we had not screened at all. So we can see that tests have both harms and benefits depending on the outcome of a test. And so the question becomes, how do we determine whether a test will be effective in a given circumstance for a particular condition? Another way of looking at this chart we've just seen here is to put this in a matrix, a 2x2 matrix here. On the top row, you'll see I've got disease condition presence. That is, whether the person truly has the disease, positive or negative, so yes or no. And then in the vertical column on the left, we have two possible outcomes of the test for that condition. Either the test comes back positive or negative. Now, in the first upper quadrant on the left side of this, we have true positives. That is, the person has a disease and they test positive. On the bottom left quadrant square, we have a false negative. That is, the test comes back negative even though the person has the disease. On the top right quadrant, we have a false positive result. That is, the person doesn't have the disease, but the test comes back positive. And then in the bottom right quadrant, we have a true negative result. The person doesn't have the disease, but the test also comes back negative correctly. So here are the four possibilities, just as we saw in the last diagram, but this way laid out as a matrix, the possibilities of outcomes when we're testing for a person's disease or condition, whatever it might be. So the first thing we might ask is, how do we determine the sensitivity of a test? That is, we ask the question, given that someone has a disease, how likely is it they will test positive? Well, to do this, we have to be interested in the conditions and possible test outcome when the person has the disease. Here you see I've circled, for disease being positive or present, two possible outcomes of a test. The test can either be a true positive result, that is, we know the person has the disease and they test positive, or there can be a false negative result, that is, the person tests negative even though they have disease. The sensitivity is a ratio. It takes the number of true positives over all possible test results when a person has disease, both true positives and false negatives. So we divide true positives by the number of true positives plus false negatives, and that will give us the sensitivity of the test. 1/2 of the type of components we need in order to determine the test's accuracy. We need both sensitivity and specificity of a test to determine the test's accuracy. So then we ask the question, what about the test's specificity, the second component to the test's accuracy? That is, if the person doesn't have the disease, remember for sensitivity we were asking what happens when they do have the disease with the test results. Here we're asking the question, what about if they don't have the disease? How likely is it they will test negative, the condition we're hoping to come about if the test is truly accurate? Well, here we're looking at the right-hand side of this diagram in the 2x2 matrix, and we're asking for the number of true negative results over the number of false positives plus true negatives, all the possible test conditions that can come out when a person has a negative condition, and that is they don't have the disease. So we take the number of true negatives and we divide it by the number of false positives plus true negatives. That will give us the test's specificity. So given those two conditions, and one more thing that we need to know, the condition's prevalence, the disease's background rate in the population, we can then come up with, using something called Bayes' theorem, named after a reverend in the 1700s, Reverend Thomas Bayes, who was also an armchair mathematician and developed this mathematics. We can ask the question that given that a person tested positive, how likely is it that they have the disease? Now notice this question. This question is asking a question that is something that we can pragmatically answer. Because after all, we, unless we're omniscient, won't know whether the person has the disease or doesn't have the disease in advance. That is why we are testing them, to try to hopefully get out some sort of determinative answer of whether they do or do not have the disease. All we will know as humans and not as God is whether they have tested positive or negative. So we ask the question, given that they have tested positive, how likely is it that they have the disease? Notice that when we completed the 2x2 table, it incorporated two sorts of statistics, both the sensitivity and specificity. But we also want to know the prevalence of the harm. That is, how likely is it that the person actually has the condition as a background incidence in the population? Each of these components, the sensitivity, the specificity, and the prevalence of the condition, affects what conclusions we can make about the positive predictive value. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, people sometimes make this mistake. The PPV is not sensitivity. These are what are called mirror conditional probabilities, and they are not necessarily the same thing. Remember, the PPV asks, given that I tested positive, how likely is it I have the disease? The sensitivity says, given that I have the disease, how likely is it that I tested positive? So we're interested in the PPV again because we are only able as humans to know the test results. We don't know in advance whether or not the person has the disease. So let's see an example of how we would calculate the positive predictive value using the matrix we just saw before, the 2x2 matrix. Let's make some assumptions here so that we can see how this would work with some real numbers. Let's assume the test has a 90% sensitivity. It has a 95% specificity. So this is a very accurate test. And let's assume for some reason we knew that in the background population at large, the prevalence of the condition is 0.01%. That is, we know that out of 100,000 people randomly sampled in the population, 10 people, and we don't know which 10 people in advance, but we know that 10 people will have the condition that we're looking for. The question we're asking is, for any given test result, if we were to screen people, how likely is it that the person actually has the condition, given that they in fact have tested positive? So we can do this by working through the matrix. The first thing would be to say, if the harm were truly present, the person actually has the condition, how likely is it that the test result will be positive? Well, here what we do is we multiply the sensitivity of the test times the number of cases in the population. There are 10 cases in the background population. The test will be 90% accurate, which means out of 10 cases, the test will pick up 9 of the 10 true positives. So the answer would be that for people who have the condition, given a positive test result, 9 of the 10 will reflect true positive test results and truly identify a person who has the disease. But the converse of that is that of the 10 people who tested, who have the condition, 9 tested positive. That means 1 did not test positive, 1 tested negative. So we will actually get 1 false negative result. That is a person who has the disease or condition who tests negative incorrectly. So there's 1 false negative and 9 true positives in this test, given a background rate of 10 cases out of 100,000 prevalence. Well, what about the other results? Well, here we're looking at people who do not have the disease, and we're testing them. The specificity for this test, notice, was 95%, we said. And the healthy background population is 99,990. That is, we're assuming there's 100,000 people we're screening, and 95% of those people we know in advance are not going to test positive if in fact they have do not have the disease. That is, they will truly test negative. So 94,990 people out of the 100,000 will test negative. And those are also true negative test results. So we can be confident that of these 94,990 do not have the condition when they test negative. But there's a false error rate here. There's people who are going to test positive even though they don't have the condition. To get this number, we subtract the number of healthy people, 99,990. We know that as the prevalence, not of the disease, but of the healthy condition. We subtract the number of people we know to be unhealthy from the total population. That gives us 99,990 because 10 people we know have the condition. And then we subtract the number of true negatives, 94,990. And from that, we get that there's 5,000 people who will test positive even though they don't have the condition. Now, this is actually a pretty high number. 5,000 people are going to be told that they have the condition when in fact they are healthy. But the problem with this is, even with a very high accuracy of the test, a specificity of 95%, because so many people do not have the condition, we're going to create a lot of false positives here. We don't have a lot of false negatives, notice, but we have many false positives. 5,000 out of basically 100,000 people are going to test positive even though they don't have the condition. So that's what we're interested in here. If a test result comes back positive, how likely is it that the person actually has disease? So here we've circled what would be the PPV, the number of true positive test results divided by the total number of positive test results. So 9 will truly have the disease, and 5,000 do not, but the total number of people testing positive is 5,009, 5,000 plus 9. And so 9 divided by 5,009 gives us a positive predictive value of 0.18, a very low likelihood. Think about this for a moment. Basically what it's saying is if you get a positive test result, the odds are 5 times lower than 1% that you actually have the disease. This is not a test that's going to tell us much whether or not we should do further intervention. In fact, most people who would look at results like this would simply say it's not worth actually doing the test, because even if you get a positive result back, the great odds are that you don't have the condition. So even though it will pick up most of the people who have the condition when they truly do, it will not actually be a very useful test because the PPV is so low. Now let's contrast this, for example, with where we take a prevalence of 10%. So the test is still just as accurate as it was before. 90% sensitivity and 95% specificity. The test's accuracy is unchanged. All we're changing here is the prevalence in the population of the condition that we're screening for. So this time we've had a 1,000-fold increase in prevalence. It's still a fairly low prevalence. Only 10% of the population has this condition, but much, much higher than in the last scenario we just went through. What happens here? Well, if we run those results this time and just change only the prevalence of those people who actually have the harm or condition, 900 will test positive, 100 will test negative. But what about among those people who do not have the condition and test? We'll see that 8,550 of those people will test negative when they don't have the condition, and only 450 will test positive. This is in a population of 10,000. We're doing a 10,000 person population instead of 100,000 here, but the idea is the same. And so if we did this and we do a PPV screening on this, we get a PPV ratio of 66.7%. Remember in the last scenario, it was 0.18%. Here, it's 2/3, meaning that of the people who test positive, 2/3 of them truly have the disease. Well, that's a test that's much more accurate, that tells us something that we can actually have some confidence in truly screening correctly for this disease. And so notice the only thing that has changed in this scenario from the last one is the prevalence. The test accuracy was the same as in the last case. What we see from this is that PPV is not really affected by the accuracy of a test, either the sensitivity or the specificity of it. When you have a low prevalence, here's a scenario, ignore the pink line, just look at the blue line below, where the prevalence is 0.01%. We notice that when the prevalence is low, the PPV is really not affected by the test's sensitivity. So we see that at best, even when the test is very sensitive and has a 0.95% accuracy on the far right side of the bottom axis, that the PPV only is 20% even when the test is extremely, extremely accurate. This is the same when we look at the specificity of the test. If the prevalence is very low, the PPV is not affected by improving the test's specificity. In fact, when it gets to 0.95, again, of test specificity and its accuracy, again, the PPV doesn't even exceed 20%. What these two graphs taken together indicate is that even if you get a very accurate test, a 99% accurate test, if the prevalence is low, the test will not yield good results when we're trying to screen for a disease. It will reflect very high false error rates and lead us to conclude that the test is worthless. And you see this in the final graph of today, where we have on the bottom axis the percent of prevalence of the condition in the population, from 0.01, very low prevalence on the left-hand side, all the way to nearly 100% of the prevalence on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand vertical axis, we see the percent of false positives in the population when we screen, given the prevalence. Notice that when the prevalence is 0.01%, we are going to have a huge error rate, almost 100%, when we have a low prevalence of a condition. And then if we have a very high prevalence of a condition, nearly 100% of a disease, then we know that the false positive rate will be very low, almost zero. And so what we can determine from today's discussion is that the accuracy of a test, counterintuitively, does not matter. What matters is the test's, the prevalence of the condition in the population. If it's a cancer, what percent of the population has cancer? If it's a plague and we're screening for it to try to quarantine people, what percent of the population has the plague? If it's a very rare type of condition like terrorism, and you'll see this in future lectures, what percent of the population are terrorists? And you'll see that it's that question, rather than how accurate is our test for screening for that condition, that really drives the results of how useful it is to screen for something. That's a counterintuitive conclusion, but it's a very important one, because what it ultimately tells us is that the urge to try to create ever more accurate tests really does very little for us in terms of creating accurate results for screening for risks. What really matters is how prevalent the condition is that we're screening for. So we'll see you in a future lecture on risk screening. I hope today has provided you some intuition and insight into a very provocative idea that it doesn't matter how accurate your test is, really. What really matters is how prevalent the condition is you're screening for. I'll look forward to seeing you on the chat boards and seeing you in the next class.